In the quiet suburban streets of Bronxville, New York, on April 27, 1948, Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born into what appeared to be a typical American family. His father, Frank Abagnale Sr. was a successful businessman who owned a stationery company, while his mother, Paulette, was a French immigrant who had met his father during World War II. The family lived comfortably in their middle-class neighborhood, and young Frank seemed destined for a conventional life. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly normal household, the seeds of one of America's most audacious criminal careers were already beginning to germinate. Frank's childhood was marked by his parents' tumultuous relationship. His father was a charming man with a taste for the finer things in life, often living beyond his means and engaging in questionable business practices. From an early age, Frank observed his father's ability to talk his way out of difficult situations, to charm creditors, and to manipulate circumstances to his advantage. These observations would prove to be Frank's first lessons in the art of deception, though he didn't realize it at the time. The young Frank was intelligent, charismatic, and possessed an unusual ability to understand and exploit human psychology. He was tall for his age, mature-looking, and had a natural confidence that made adults take him seriously. These physical and psychological attributes would later become the cornerstone of his criminal enterprise, but during his early childhood, they simply made him popular among his peers and favored by his teachers. The event that would ultimately transform Frank Abagnale from a mischievous teenager into a master criminal occurred when he was just 16 years old. His parents' marriage, which had been deteriorating for years, finally collapsed in a bitter divorce. The dissolution of his family was traumatic for Frank, but what made it even more devastating was being forced to choose between his parents in court. When asked by the judge which parent he wanted to live with, Frank could not bear to make such a choice. Instead of selecting either his mother or father, he made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He ran away. With only $25 in his pocket and no clear plan, Frank found himself alone in New York City. Rather than return home and face the painful reality of his broken family, he decided to make his own way in the world. This moment marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary criminal careers in American history. What started as a teenage boy's desperate attempt to escape emotional pain would evolve into a sophisticated operation that would span multiple countries and involve millions of dollars in fraudulent activities. Frank's initial foray into criminal activity was born out of necessity rather than malicious intent. Needing money to survive on his own, he began with small-scale check fraud. He opened a checking account with a small deposit and then began the practice of check kiting, writing checks for amounts larger than his account balance and then covering them with deposits from other fraudulent sources before the checks cleared. What made Frank different from typical teenage delinquents was his methodical approach to crime and his ability to learn from each experience. He quickly realized that his youthful appearance was actually a liability in his criminal endeavors. Bank tellers and merchants were naturally suspicious of a teenager attempting to cash large checks. This realization led to his first major innovation, age manipulation. Frank began experimenting with ways to make himself appear older and more credible. He purchased expensive suits, practiced walking and talking with the confidence of a businessman, and studied the mannerisms of successful adults. He also discovered that certain professions commanded automatic respect and trust, and this insight would become the foundation of his most elaborate cons. Frank's most famous and audacious impersonation was that of a Pan-American World Airways pilot. This con began almost by accident when Frank noticed how airline pilots were treated with exceptional deference and respect wherever they went. Hotels offered them free accommodations, restaurants provided complimentary meals, and other airlines extended professional courtesies that allowed pilots to fly as passengers on their aircraft, a practice known as deadheading. To assume this identity, Frank conducted meticulous research. He called Pan Am's corporate headquarters, claiming to be a pilot who had lost his uniform while traveling, and asked detailed questions about replacement procedures. Through these conversations, he learned about uniform specifications, company policies, and airline industry terminology. He then visited Pan Am's offices, boldly walking into their administrative areas and obtaining genuine company materials, including an official ID badge template and uniform specifications. Frank had replica uniforms made by a tailor, complete with authentic-looking Pan Am wings and captain's stripes. He obtained a pilot's license template and created a convincing fake ID. But perhaps most impressively, he learned to speak the language of aviation fluently. He studied flight manuals, memorized airport codes, and practiced aviation terminology until he could discuss flight operations, navigation, and aircraft specifications with convincing expertise. The pilot impersonation was not just about free travel and accommodation, though Frank did deadhead on over 250 flights, traveling more than 1 million miles and visiting 26 countries during his Pan Am career. The real genius of this con was how it provided him with an unassailable alibi and unlimited mobility. When questioned about his presence in any location, Frank simply explained that he was a pilot on layover. The uniform and credentials were so convincing that no one ever questioned his story. During his time as a fake pilot, Frank stayed in the finest hotels, ate at the best restaurants, and lived a lifestyle that most legitimate airline pilots could only dream of. He became friends with Real Pan Am employees, attended company parties, and even dated several flight attendants who never suspected his true identity. The psychological aspect of this con was perhaps most remarkable. Frank didn't just dress like a pilot, he became one in every way except for the ability to actually fly a plane. After 2 years of living as a pilot, Frank grew bored with the routine and began looking for new challenges. His next impersonation would take him into the world of medicine, where the stakes were considerably higher. Frank decided to become Dr. Frank Williams, a Harvard Medical School graduate specializing in pediatrics. To prepare for this role, Frank moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where he rented an apartment near several young doctors and residents. He spent months studying medical textbooks, journals, and terminology. He learned to speak fluently about medical procedures, pharmaceutical drugs, and hospital protocols. He also observed the behavior and mannerisms of real doctors, noting how they interacted with patients, nurses, and other medical professionals. Frank's medical con was facilitated by a crucial discovery. In the 1960s, medical credentials were rarely verified thoroughly, especially for temporary or consulting positions. He created fake transcripts from Harvard Medical School and bogus references from prestigious hospitals. When he applied for a position as a supervising resident at a hospital in Atlanta, his impressive credentials and confident demeanor convinced the administrators to hire him without conducting a detailed background check. For nearly a year, Frank worked as a doctor in the pediatrics ward. The irony of this situation was profound. A 19-year-old high school dropout was supervising genuine medical school graduates and making decisions about patient care. However, Frank was careful to avoid situations where his lack of medical knowledge could harm patients. He focused on administrative duties and relied heavily on the expertise of nurses and other doctors when dealing with actual medical issues. The psychological pressure of maintaining this impersonation was enormous. Frank lived in constant fear of being exposed, knowing that a single mistake could not only end his con but potentially harm innocent people. He developed sophisticated strategies for deflecting difficult medical questions and became expert at appearing knowledgeable while actually saying very little of substance. Frank's third major professional impersonation took him into the legal world, where he assumed the identity of a Harvard Law School graduate and practiced attorney. This con began when Frank met a real lawyer at a hotel bar who complained about the difficulty of passing the Louisiana bar exam. Intrigued by this challenge, Frank decided to see if he could succeed where many legitimate law school graduates had failed. Frank moved to Louisiana and began an intensive study of state law. He obtained study materials for the bar exam and spent months memorizing legal precedents, statutes, and procedures. He also created false transcripts from Harvard Law School and fabricated a legal resume with impressive but unverifiable credentials. When Frank took the Louisiana bar examination, he was competing against genuine law school graduates who had spent years preparing for legal careers. Against all odds, he passed the exam on his first attempt, a feat that many legitimate lawyers struggle to achieve. This success granted him a license to practice law in Louisiana, making him, technically, a real attorney despite having no formal legal education. Frank established a small practice and began handling routine legal matters. Like his medical impersonation, he was careful to avoid complex cases that might expose his lack of formal training. He focused on simple procedures and paperwork, often referring more complicated matters to other attorneys. His natural intelligence and quick learning ability allowed him to handle basic legal work competently, though he was constantly walking a tightrope between success and exposure. In addition to his 3 major professional impersonations, Frank also briefly worked as a college professor, claiming to be a doctoral candidate in sociology. This con was perhaps the easiest to maintain, as academic credentials in the 1960s were even less rigorously verified than medical or legal qualifications. Frank taught summer school classes at Brigham Young University, where his youthful appearance was actually an advantage. He looked like a typical graduate student. Frank prepared for this role by reading extensively about sociology and educational theory. He developed lesson plans, created examinations, and even graded student papers. His natural charisma and intelligence made him popular with students, who rated him highly in course evaluations. The irony was that Frank, who had never completed high school, was successfully teaching college-level courses to students who were often older and more formally educated than he was. What made Frank Abagnale extraordinary was not just his ability to assume false identities, but his profound understanding of human psychology. He intuitively grasped that people see what they expect to see and believe what they want to believe. When someone encountered a person in a pilot's uniform with the appropriate credentials, they automatically assumed that person was a pilot. The uniform and props did most of the work. Frank simply had to avoid contradicting people's expectations. Frank also understood the power of confidence and authority. He learned that if he acted like he belonged somewhere, most people would assume he did. He walked into restricted areas, accessed confidential information, and commanded respect simply by behaving as if he had every right to do so. This psychological insight allowed him to succeed in situations where more timid criminals would have failed. Perhaps most importantly, Frank understood that his cons worked because they fulfilled other people's needs and desires. Hotels wanted prestigious guests, airlines wanted professional cooperation, hospitals needed competent staff, and law firms required qualified attorneys. Frank provided what these institutions wanted, even though his qualifications were entirely fictional. As long as he performed adequately in his assumed roles, everyone was satisfied with the arrangement. While Frank's impersonations garnered the most attention, the financial foundation of his criminal enterprise was sophisticated check fraud. Frank was a pioneer in the field of document forgery, developing techniques that were years ahead of law enforcement's ability to detect them. Frank's check fraud operation involved multiple sophisticated techniques. He printed fake checks using legitimate bank routing numbers and account information obtained through various means. He created false identification documents to support these checks, including driver's licenses, social security cards, and employee identification badges. He also developed a network of mail drops and temporary addresses to avoid detection while cashing fraudulent checks across multiple states. One of Frank's most innovative techniques was the manipulation of MICR, magnetic ink character recognition, encoding on checks. He discovered that by altering the magnetic ink numbers at the bottom of checks, he could direct funds to accounts he controlled while making the transactions appear legitimate to bank processing systems. This technique allowed him to steal money from banks without them realizing it for days or weeks after the transactions occurred. Frank also pioneered the use of multiple identities for financial fraud. He maintained dozens of fake personas, each with complete documentation including birth certificates, social security numbers, and credit histories. He could seamlessly switch between these identities, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to track his activities or predict his next move. As Frank's crimes became more sophisticated and widespread, law enforcement agencies began to take notice. The FBI launched a dedicated investigation into his activities, led by Special Agent Joseph Shea. Agent Shea became obsessed with capturing Frank, recognizing that his crimes represented a new and dangerous evolution in fraud and identity theft. The investigation was complicated by Frank's mobility and the multiple jurisdictions involved in his crimes. He had committed offenses in all 50 states and several foreign countries, making coordination between law enforcement agencies extremely difficult. Additionally, Frank's multiple identities made it hard for investigators to track his movements or predict his behavior patterns. Frank seemed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement through a combination of careful planning, good intelligence, and sheer audacity. He monitored police communications using radio scanners, cultivated informants within the organizations he targeted, and maintained escape plans for every situation. When heat from law enforcement became too intense in one area, he simply moved to another state or country and assumed a new identity. The psychological game between Frank and his pursuers was as important as the technical aspects of the investigation. Frank enjoyed the thrill of outwitting law enforcement and took pride in his ability to evade capture. He sometimes taunted investigators by leaving subtle clues about his identity or location, confident that he could escape before they could respond. As domestic law enforcement pressure increased, Frank expanded his operations internationally. His pilot's uniform provided perfect cover for international travel, and his multiple identities allowed him to establish operations in countries where American law enforcement had limited jurisdiction. Frank operated extensively in Europe, particularly in France, where his mother's background had given him some familiarity with the language and culture. He also worked in Sweden, Germany, and other European countries, adapting his techniques to local banking systems and legal environments. In each country, he studied local customs, learned basic language skills, and developed new personas appropriate to the cultural context. The international aspect of Frank's crimes made him one of the first truly global con artists. He exploited differences in law enforcement cooperation, banking regulations, and extradition laws to stay ahead of his pursuers. When American authorities got close to capturing him in one country, he simply moved to another, where he could continue his operations with relative impunity. Frank's criminal career came to an end not through superior detective work, but through a combination of overconfidence and bad luck. After years of successful cons, Frank had become careless about maintaining his various false identities. He began using the same aliases in multiple locations and failed to maintain the careful operational security that had previously protected him. The beginning of the end came when Frank made a critical error in France. He attempted to cash a fraudulent check at a bank where he had previously conducted legitimate transactions under another identity. A sharp-eyed teller recognized him despite his different appearance and alias, and contacted the police. French authorities arrested Frank in December 1969, when he was just 21 years old. The arrest came as a shock to Frank, who had begun to believe that he was invincible. For the first time in years, he found himself in a situation where his charm, intelligence, and false credentials could not save him. Frank's arrest in France triggered a complex international legal battle. Multiple countries wanted to prosecute him for crimes committed within their jurisdictions, while the FBI sought his extradition to the United States to face federal charges. The legal proceedings dragged on for months as different governments argued over who had the primary claim to prosecute him. During this time, Frank was held in a French prison under harsh conditions. The contrast between his previous lifestyle of luxury hotels and gourmet restaurants and the reality of a French jail cell was stark. For the first time since beginning his criminal career, Frank had time to reflect on his actions and their consequences. The French legal system treated Frank's crimes seriously, and he faced the possibility of spending decades in European prisons before ever being returned to the United States. This prospect was particularly frightening because European prison conditions in the 1960s were notoriously harsh, especially for foreign criminals. Eventually, diplomatic negotiations resulted in Frank's extradition to the United States, where he faced federal charges for check fraud, forgery, and impersonation. The FBI had built a comprehensive case against him, documenting hundreds of separate criminal acts across multiple states and several years. Frank's return to American soil marked the end of his international adventure but the beginning of a new phase in his relationship with law enforcement. Agent Joseph Shea, who had led the investigation into Frank's crimes, developed an unusual respect for his quarry's intelligence and creativity. This relationship would prove crucial to Frank's future. When Frank appeared in federal court, the extent of his crimes was finally revealed publicly. The media was fascinated by the story of the teenage con artist who had successfully impersonated professionals in some of America's most respected fields. Frank became a celebrity criminal, with newspapers and television programs eager to tell his story. Frank was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, a term that reflected both the scope of his crimes and the need to send a message about the consequences of fraud. However, his time in prison was unlike that of typical criminals. Frank's intelligence and unique skills made him valuable to both fellow inmates and prison administrators. During his incarceration, Frank began to reflect seriously on his criminal career for the first time. Away from the excitement and pressure of constantly maintaining false identities, he could examine his motivations and the impact of his actions on others. He realized that while his crimes might seem victimless, they had actually caused significant financial harm to banks, businesses, and individuals. Frank also began to consider what he might do with his life after prison. His criminal career had given him unique insights into security vulnerabilities and fraud prevention, knowledge that might be valuable to legitimate organizations. He started to envision a future where he could use his expertise to help prevent the types of crimes he had committed. In 1974, after Frank had served only 4 years of his 12-year sentence, he received an unexpected visit from FBI agent Joseph Shea. Shea made Frank an extraordinary offer. The FBI would arrange for his early release if he agreed to work as a consultant, helping law enforcement agencies understand and prevent fraud. This offer represented a dramatic shift in how law enforcement agencies thought about dealing with sophisticated criminals. Rather than simply punishing Frank for his crimes, the FBI recognized that his unique expertise could be valuable in fighting fraud and training agents to recognize sophisticated cons. Frank was initially skeptical of the offer, suspecting it might be another attempt to gather evidence against him. However, Agent Shea convinced him that the proposal was genuine and that it represented his best opportunity to rebuild his life in a positive direction. Frank's transition from criminal to consultant was not easy. He had to learn to work within legitimate systems after years of operating outside the law. He also had to overcome the suspicion and skepticism of law enforcement officers who viewed him as an untrustworthy criminal rather than a valuable resource. However, Frank's natural intelligence and communication skills served him well in his new role. He proved to be an effective teacher, able to explain complex fraud schemes in ways that law enforcement officers could understand and counter. He also demonstrated genuine remorse for his past actions and a sincere desire to make amends. Frank's work with the FBI was initially focused on check fraud and document forgery, areas where his expertise was most relevant. He helped develop training programs for bank employees, created detection protocols for fraudulent documents, and assisted in investigations of other sophisticated fraud cases. As Frank proved his value to law enforcement agencies, his role expanded beyond simple consultation. He began speaking at conferences, writing articles about fraud prevention, and developing training materials for financial institutions. His unique perspective, that of someone who had successfully committed the types of crimes others were trying to prevent, made him an incredibly effective educator. Frank also began working with private companies, helping them identify vulnerabilities in their security systems and develop countermeasures against fraud. His reputation grew within the business community, and he found himself in high demand as a security consultant. The transformation from criminal to legitimate businessman was complete when Frank established his own company, Abagnale and Associates, which specialized in fraud prevention and security consulting. The company's motto, "Sometimes it takes a thief to catch a thief," perfectly encapsulated Frank's unique value proposition. Frank's story captured the public imagination in a way that few criminal cases ever have. His youth, the audacity of his crimes, and his successful transformation into a legitimate businessman made him a compelling figure for media coverage. Books, documentaries, and eventually major motion pictures told and retold his story. The 2002 film, Catch Me If You Can, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Leonardo DiCaprio, brought Frank's story to a global audience. While the movie took some dramatic liberties with the facts of his case, it accurately captured the essential elements of his story: the broken family that started his criminal career, the elaborate cons that made him famous, and the eventual partnership with law enforcement that redeemed him. The media attention had both positive and negative effects on Frank's life. On one hand, it helped establish his credibility as a security expert and brought him numerous business opportunities. On the other hand, it meant that his criminal past would never be entirely behind him. He would always be known first as a former con artist and only second as a legitimate businessman. Frank Abagnale's story has had a lasting impact on both law enforcement and popular culture. His case demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation in investigating complex fraud cases and highlighted the vulnerabilities in identity verification systems that existed in the 1960s. More importantly, Frank's successful transformation from criminal to consultant established a new model for dealing with certain types of sophisticated criminals. His case showed that some offenders possess knowledge and skills that can be valuable to society if channeled in positive directions. Frank's work has contributed to significant improvements in fraud prevention and detection. Banking systems, identity verification procedures, and security protocols have all been strengthened partly as a result of insights gained from his criminal career and subsequent consulting work. Today, Frank Abagnale continues to work as a security consultant and public speaker, more than 5 decades after his arrest ended his criminal career. His story remains one of the most fascinating cases in the annals of American crime, not just because of the audacity of his cons, but because of the remarkable transformation that followed. Frank's case raises profound questions about identity, authenticity, and redemption. How could a teenager with no formal training successfully impersonate professionals in fields that require years of education and experience? What does his success say about the systems and institutions that failed to detect his deceptions? And perhaps most importantly, how can society balance the need to punish criminal behavior with the recognition that some criminals possess unique knowledge that could benefit everyone? The story of Frank Abagnale is ultimately about human potential, both its dark and light aspects. The same intelligence, charisma, and creativity that made him a master criminal also enabled him to become a force for good. His journey from con artist to consultant demonstrates that people can change, that redemption is possible, and that sometimes the most valuable insights come from the most unexpected sources. Frank Abagnale's criminal career lasted only 5 years, but its impact continues to resonate today. He changed how we think about fraud, identity, and security in ways that have made all of us safer. In the end, perhaps that is the most remarkable con of all, the transformation of one of America's most notorious criminals into one of its most effective crime fighters. The legacy of Frank Abagnale serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It warns us about the vulnerabilities in our systems and the dangers of unchecked criminal innovation. But it also shows us that no one is beyond redemption, and that even the most troubled past can be transformed into a force for positive change. In a world where identity is increasingly fluid and security threats are constantly evolving, the lessons learned from Frank Abagnale's extraordinary life remain as relevant today as they were 50 years ago.